Thanks for the opportunity to speak here. I heard you all had some quite eventful days already. So I'm Roland Vernooij, and I'm from the university in Amsterdam, the VUA University in Amsterdam. And I've been studying the dynamics of biomass burning emission factors in the savanna biome. Sorry. So for those of you that aren't familiar with emission factors, they're part of the equation to calculate emissions. And basically, emission factors tell us about the breakup of the elements in the fuel into individual emitted species. So if, for instance, a certain amount of carbon has been emitted, then emission factors tell us how much of that carbon went into carbon dioxide, carbon monoxide, and so forth. And especially for early dry season prescribed burning, this is very interesting because we know that these emission factors are dependent on, for instance, the composition of the fuel and the environmental conditions during the fire. So we know that if we burn earlier in the season, that the burned area is diminished and the total combustion completeness is a lot less, like Cameron just explained. But we also know that if we burn under unfavorable conditions, that the emission factors of certain greenhouse gases like carbon monoxide, methane, and nitrous oxide might actually increase. So this might reduce the effectiveness of emission abatement schemes in the savanna. So the way we do this is that we develop drones, and what you see here flying on the left is an example of those. And this drone is capturing 4 bags of smoke samples for each flight, and then we return it back to the ground, then install it with new bags, and then we put it back up. And then for each of these fires, we capture around 70 to 80 bags. And then we measure those bags in the evening for the concentrations of carbon dioxide, carbon monoxide, methane, and nitrous oxide. And this is especially interesting combined with the measurements that Cameron was just talking about the fuel load, about the carbon and nitrogen contents in the fuel, because that tells us something about what drives the variability in these emission factors. Now, we've been doing this for a variety of different savanna ecosystems around the globe. So in the red and orange dots here, you see the places that we've been doing these emission factors at. And in this, we've been focusing on capturing a rainfall gradient in different savanna types. So we've been looking at relatively arid savanna types in, for instance, the Tanami Desert in Australia, but also relatively humid savannas in Mozambique and Brazil, for instance. And to also capture the temporal dynamics of these emission factors, we've been revisiting these areas in different times of the season. So mostly at early dry season and late dry season. And then we complemented this data with previous measurements that were described in literature, which are the blue diamonds in this graph, to get a very diverse data set of savanna fire emission factors. So that looks a bit like this. Here you see the variety of what we found in this data set. And you don't have to look into the particular box plots now, but the main takeaways from this graph is that there's actually a substantial variability within the savanna biome compared to the single number that we previously had. But also that much of this variability, and that's what you see here in the blue box plots on the right, is actually found in relatively small landscape features. So for instance, the wet areas that align the river or are confined to certain geomorphological niches. And if we look at the landscape dominating vegetation types, then you see that in general, there's as a rule of thumb, there's more emissions of greenhouse gases per kilogram of biomass burned. So more harmful like more harmful emissions in areas that have a higher tree cover or have a higher rainfall in general as well. So now, of course, we cannot measure emission factors straight from the satellite yet. So what we done instead of that, in order to extrapolate these findings and use them in modeling, we estimated the emission factors based on satellite proxies. So what you see here in the graph on the left is every one of these triangles represents a single fire. And the orange triangles represent the training data, the blue triangles represent the validation data, and the red vertical line represents the value, the fixed static biome average that was previously used. And in order to further simplify these models, we only picked the 5 satellite features that were most indicative of each species. And then here on the here in these panels, you see the models, the performance of the models for estimating the emission factors of methane, nitrous oxide, and carbon monoxide for all these single fires. So you see that the models represent a big improvement over using a single static number. What you also see here in the panel in the middle, for instance, is that most of these measurements are actually below the red vertical line. And that's one of our main findings as well, is that actually the emission factors for nitrous oxides have been overestimated in previous studies. It shows a bit more drastic than it is, because relatively dry savannas are over represented in our data, but it does reduce the average nitrous oxide emission factor. Now, in order to extrapolate this, we basically just need the satellite products or the satellite derived products for all of these species, for all of these features. And in terms of the temporal and spatial resolution of our emission factor estimates, we can go as high as the highest resolution that we find in our features. So, for instance, we have a 500-meter tree cover percentage based on MODIS and a daily vapor pressure deficit. Then we can basically estimate 500-meter emission factors on a daily basis. If you see here on the panel on the bottom right, we also introduced the land cover classification mask. So it's good to know that our measurements have only been done in savanna ecosystems. So we do not try to estimate emission factors for other biomes. So in order to get those biomes emission factors, static emission factors based on previous studies, are superimposed on the emission factors calculated for the savannas. So those remain the same. So this is what you get then. This is an example for the emission factors in the tile H20V10, the MODIS tile, on the 1st of June 2019. This is at a 500-meter resolution. And this is the emission factor of carbon monoxide. I'm taking carbon monoxide here because carbon monoxide is a good indication of the combustion completeness of the fire. So in that sense, carbon monoxide emission factors are also strongly correlated to emission factors of, for instance, methane, but also non-methane hydrocarbons and particles. And if we then calculate these emissions over time, and we should focus here on the savannas, so particularly Africa, Brazil, and Australia, of course, is that you clearly see a strong spatial distribution. Sorry, the colors the red colors here represent areas where the emission factors are higher than the previous emission factors that we're using an average, so a static average. And the blue colors are vice versa, so they're lower than the static average. So what you see here is that in higher rainfall areas, in general, the emissions of carbon monoxide, methane, and nitrous oxide are higher than previously thought, whereas in the more arid savannas, these emissions are slightly lower. And what you also clearly see is that there's a clear seasonality in these emission factors. So in the end of the dry season, under very dry circumstances, we see that that emissions of greenhouse gases are reduced, and that's particularly the case in dry savannas. What you see here is a temporal profile for the emission factors, again for CO. These are the orange lines for different savanna types. The black lines represent the total burned area around throughout the year. And the different lines represent different type of savannas. The shaded areas represent campaigns that we had in Southern Africa. But what you clearly see is that in the more woody vegetated areas, that the emission factors are much higher for CO. But also that in the temporal profile, that in the towards the end of the dry season, they actually increase. So this is something that we found that we can explain using the fuel measurements, the combustion completeness measurements that that Cameron has just been explaining. Because we see that during the end of the dry season, the fires consume a lot more live biomass, coarse woody debris, and also denser litter layers. So these type of fuels, they tend to emit a lot more greenhouse gases, a lot more carbon monoxide and methane compared to just very dry grasses. Now, what I've been presenting here is the quarter-degree daily resolution global dynamic emission factors. This is what we use for global and modeling studies. But as I also said, we can go to a much higher resolution. So if there's interest in that, we could definitely go to much higher resolutions, which I think is more relevant for the applications we're discussing here. Another thing that we're doing is we're also using this in higher resolution emission estimates, which we're now working on using Sentinel, burned area, and higher resolution models for African emission studies. So that was it for me. Thanks everyone, and if you have any questions.
Thanks very much, Roland. Again, we'll just ask if there's time for a question. Lucian.
Forgive me if this is a silly question, but have you plotted or modeled these greenhouse gas emissions as a function of biomass per unit area, so that, for example, if under a known fire regime of, say, low frequency or low intensity, you could predict emissions purely from the biomass present, and that data could potentially be extrapolated to different vegetation types and different biomes, because as far as I'm aware, different species don't have different compositions, particularly different chemical compositions, and the intensity of a fire and the emissions that you would expect from a burnt area is purely on the biomass and the wood density, the amount of wood in that area. And so that would allow you to predict emissions purely for an area and for a landscape or a vegetation type purely from an analysis of the biomass in that area.
So you mean like estimating the emission factors for instance, trees on itself, or for grasses, or like certain parts of the ecosystem?
Yeah, so if you had an idea of what the biomass, the tons of dry matter of woody biomass for an area was, you would be able to, that's if there was something like a correlation between that and a consistent, relatively strong correlation between that and the emissions that you could expect. Once you had a measure of that biomass, you would be able to predict under a known regime, within a known regime, the emissions that you might expect for that circumstance.
Yeah, I think for a large extent that would be possible, especially during late dry season conditions where if the conditions are fairly stable. What we do also find is that the emission factors are quite dependent on the environmental conditions, the meteorological conditions under which that fire takes place. So I don't think we can say, especially for instance for grassland, that if you burn grasses that they will always have a certain emission factor. That depends a lot on the moisture content and also the surrounding fuel, I think. So you would still have a certain you'd have a model based on individual fuels, I think, fuel compounds that's still dependent on the meteorological conditions. Is that what you mean?
Yeah, okay, thanks. There's a lot more variables there than just biomass. Cheers.
Okay, thanks very much, Roland. That's pretty fantastic work. And you've been a very fortunate PhD student, I say, to travel the world like you have.